China is working wonders in Africa and the West is not happy about it. So they're telling African leaders not to keep working with China.
They're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port,
And
harbors.
what's wrong with that?
And, well, because...
Countries that need ports, get ports.
But they're making people dependent on... I mean, I know, it's the same thing that we've done, which is
no, it's
horrible
not.
Around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Can President Biden convince African leaders that America is a better partner than China?
Many Western powers, including the USA, France, and other European countries, have been in Africa for quite a while.
Africa should never be seen as a continent that needs generosity.
As we all know, the West prefers humanitarian aid to Africa, while China is signing investment and infrastructural deals with African countries. But this is gradually changing. Now, here's what China is doing. Between the years 2000 to 2020, China has helped African countries build 13,000 plus kilometers long railways, nearly 100,000 kilometers of highways, about 1,000 bridges, nearly 100 ports, and more than 80 large-scale power facilities. Just last year in 2022 alone, China had invested over $261 billion as opposed to about $64 billion from the USA. So I have to ask this question, is China winning in Africa? Well, for me, it's not just about winning, because Africa isn't a trophy for someone to win. But I believe China is succeeding in Africa because of the terms and the kind of deals that they are signing as compared to the Western countries who always see Africa as a continent needing aid every time. And again, I believe that China has had this success because they are signing amicable deals which is profitable for both the African continent and for China. Because of course, Africa has the resources and the raw materials, and China has the production capacity for those raw materials. Of course, other countries like the USA and across Europe also have the production capacity. But which country is signing the most favorable deals with African countries, which is further beneficial for both the country they are signing with and the production country? Now, millennials, as we can clearly see, China is signing reasonable and profitable deals for African countries and for China at the same time, which is something that is usually unheard of in the past between the African countries and the Western countries. So as an African myself who grew up in a country where there was French and British rule, I saw and felt all the experiences firsthand, and that hugely affected the growth of the country. China is not building dozens of military bases in Africa. Instead, they are building railway lines, road, hospitals, schools, and much more needed infrastructure in Africa. All these numerous trade and infrastructural deals between China and Africa isn't just helping the general public, but of course helping the youth and helping people to get more jobs. As you can clearly see, there are so many African youths getting employed in these Chinese companies developing Africa. Of course, personally, my hope is that someday Africa will be able to build all this infrastructure themselves and of course create our own production facilities, create our own infrastructures by ourselves. But while waiting for that day to come, we need to start signing reasonable deals now, which will definitely lead us to that point. But if we are not signing reasonable deals with the West or with China, how will we ever grow in Africa? And that is the reason why I believe China is winning in Africa.
We are not going there as beggars. We are not going to ask for a favor to both Ukraine and Russia. Africa should never be seen as a continent that needs generosity.
So what I believe is happening right now in Africa is that African leaders are beginning to care for their countries and for their citizens more. Of course, it's a work in progress, it's a slow and gradual process, but I believe that they will definitely get there. Now, while I was growing up in Africa as a kid, I used to watch the news about billions of dollars sent from the US, from European countries to Africa as aid. What was the aid for? And again, after all these years, what benefit has all the aid brought to African countries? I'll read on the news, Africa receives aid from the USA, Africa receives aid from the UK, Africa receives aid from France. But then I used to ask myself as a young African kid, where does all this aid go to? How does all this aid benefit the people at the bottom? And now I can give clear answers with regards to China. Because with the roads, with the railway systems, with everything that is being built by China in Africa, it is clear, even the common man can benefit from the infrastructures that China is bringing to Africa, which is definitely a huge win, not just for the leaders of Africa alone, but also for the common people all across the 54 countries in Africa. Again, millennials, while growing up, I noticed that most of the Western countries When they think of Africa, they think as one country and also determine what African leaders should do and not do with the resources on the continent. But then China is clearly changing that viewpoint. China is clearly integrating itself with each and every country separately. As it can clearly be seen, China is signing deals with various African countries separately, not as a whole entity. And China isn't trying to give instructions to African countries on who to trade with or who to work with and who not to work with, unlike most of the Western countries. And Willenials, as we have always seen for many, many years, African leaders have always asked for a voice on the global stage. They have always tried to be represented equally, but that has never been the case. But China is changing that narrative. China is coming to Africa as an equal partner. Of course, I know so many people will say, oh, China is holding African countries down with debts. China is going to own Africa. China is owning Africa. China is seizing Africa. Africa was already owned by the West. And right up until today, there's so many African countries indebted to France. There's so many African countries indebted to the USA, and they aren't even able to pay. That's the reason why many African countries today still have to pledge allegiance to these Western countries. Now, millennials, let's try to use some simple logic right here. Let me ask you guys this question. Who is better for Africa and who signs better trade deals with Africa? The USA, France, the UK, or China? I'll let you guys answer that in the comment section below. I hope you can use your own personal logic to be able to answer this question. Now, a few months ago, the US VP visited Ghana in Africa while on her African tour and urged African leaders not to keep working with China. What is the reason for this? So when I saw that and I watched the news, I began to ask myself, what is the reason for one country asking another country not to work or not to do trade deals with another country? Because for me, as someone with a background in business, I believe that if you have a trading partner doing more trade deals with another partner, you should do your best to improve your own level of trade deals and of course your own terms of signing the trade deals with the said partner so that you can better have a competitive advantage. I actually read somewhere a funny comment where someone said, a US politician makes a trip to Africa, lands in a Chinese airport built by China, rides on a road in Africa built by China, and gets to a building in Africa built by China, and then asks the African audience not to work with China. That's really funny because when we put all of this together, what's the reason that will push these leaders not to want to keep working with China instead of the West? Instead of the Western countries advising or asking the African countries not to work or trade with China, I believe what they should be doing is instead launching counter-development goals to be able to convince these African leaders that they are the better trading partner. Because of course, that is exactly what China is doing, and that's the reason why I believe China is winning in Africa. It's simple, it's basic common sense. And I believe with China coming into the picture right now, it changes the whole game. And of course, it's beneficial for Africa. Again, I hope someday Africa will be able to carry out its own infrastructural development, build its own roads, build its own hospitals, and sign more reasonable trade deals for themselves, and of course process all the minerals and raw materials in the African continent and be able to sell all this out of Africa. But while waiting for that day to come, we need to sign the best deals, and it is clear, we can clearly see who is signing the best deals with Africa, for Africa, and of course for their own country. The truth is that China is actually making the whole world look much more beautiful and better. Of course, there are setbacks. There can be setbacks here and there. Maybe sometimes all the projects might not be done. Of course, we are all human, like I always say. But then when we put all the infrastructural developments together, we can clearly see the amazing job it is doing for the lives of the citizens of numerous countries, not just in Africa, but across Asia and of course in South America. You all should understand that African countries do not own the most debt to China. The USA, for example, owes China about $859 billion. The UK owes China about $668 billion. Not to talk of Australia owing China about $130 billion. So it's very normal for a country to owe another country. But the question should be, what benefits does this country get when they owe another country? Even though some African countries do owe China, we can clearly see the infrastructural development that is being carried out across the African continent with all of this budget taken from China. And of course, if you look deeply into the trade terms between China and African countries, it is clearly favorable, unlike what is portrayed in most of the Western media. Now, millennials, when I talk about the Western powers signing trade deals with Africa and of course infrastructural and development deals, and of course China signing trade deals and infrastructural deals with Africa, it doesn't mean that Africans do not have their own job to do. Africans, of course, have their own jobs to do. Despite so many factors holding many African leaders and many African countries back, I still believe that Africans are doing the best and Africans still have a lot to do to be able to develop our continent and get it to the point where we all want it to be. And again, one of the reasons why I say China is winning in Africa is because if you observe recently, the European Union even began to offer infrastructural budget to Africa, unlike before where they used to offer mostly humanitarian aid. Right now, they are beginning to sign better trade deals and of course better infrastructural deals with Africa. I believe with China in the picture right now, all other countries are sitting up right and wanting to do the real deal with Africa. Now, millennials, I believe that the more China develops, is the more that more countries across the globe will also develop alongside. Because from what I understand, China knows exactly how it is to have a struggling economy, which is what so many countries across the globe are currently going through. And again, by China signing amicable and reasonable deals with African countries, with South American countries, and of course with other countries across the globe, it definitely helps to develop these countries and of course push their economies forward for a better future for these countries and of course for the citizens of these countries. I am no political analyst, I am just a citizen of the world, and I want just the best for everyone, everywhere. It doesn't matter where you are located, whether in Africa, across Europe, in North America, in South America, across Asia, in Australia. It doesn't matter where you are. My hope in making these videos is just to shed more light on the reality of everything happening in the world and how beneficial it can be for struggling countries to be able to work hard for the better future of each country. I am not supporting a particular country. All I am doing is simply outlining the facts which can help you watching this video and myself to of course have and live a better life. By the way, let me ask this question again. Who do you think is better for Africa? The USA, France, the UK, or China? Feel free to drop your answer in the comment section and of course we can definitely talk about it. Thank you so much for watching this video. Remember, this is Willene. See you next time.